On August 14, 2013, at 4:47 a.m., UPS Flight 1354, an Airbus A300-600, crashed during a localizer non-precision approach to runway 18 at Birmingham Shuttlesworth International Airport. Both the captain and first officer died. In every investigation, the NTSB looks at the humans, the machine, and the environment. In this case, the question was how a qualified, experienced flight crew flew a mechanically sound airplane into the ground.
This flight started out as any flight as we would expect. The flight crew was communicating, they were following procedures, the takeoff, climb out, cruise portion of the flight was normal. It was during the approach that things really started to break down and the crew failed to follow procedures.
Within an operation of an aircraft, there's always several layers of safety. Each layer, however, has its own deficiency, its own weakness. When each of those weaknesses all align, that can allow the accident to happen, which is what happened in this case.
It was only in the air that they realized that the longer ILS-equipped runway was unavailable. They would have to fly a non-precision approach to the shorter runway 18, which had only a localizer, not an ILS.
The pilots were planning to fly the non-precision approach using the localizer beam, which is a ground-based antenna, to laterally fly to the runway. To descend on the approach, they were going to use the flight management computer, or FMC, a computer-generated glide slope, to descend on the approach. When they got vectors for the approach, at that point in time, they needed to sequence the FMC. In other words, tell the computer that I am now flying the approach and I have a glide slope that I'm going to fly down to. They missed that step, so the computer was never programmed properly for the approach.
We are viewing the flight crew's actions through the lens of a fatal crash, their worst day. But was there anything about this flight crew that suggested that they might normally miss such a critical step?
These pilots were good pilots.
We talked to crew members that had flown with the crew before to find out what their normal pattern was in the cockpit. Did they follow procedures? Did they communicate? Did they make good decisions? And everybody that we talked to said that they did.
But they were having a bad day. There's several factors involved with that. Fatigue, time of night, the change in operations they had to do.
Based on the available data that we had, the captain was fit for duty. Both pilots did have adequate rest opportunity, and the captain did adequately use that time that he had available to him the day before the accident. The first officer, on the other hand, we found that she had an extended period of time outside of her hotel room and also excessive cell phone use during the day, which did not allow her to get adequate rest prior to returning for duty.
Fatigued, the first officer failed to clear a discontinuity by sequencing the approach in the flight management computer. But the first officer's fatigue was not the only factor that affected the flight crew's judgment.
It first started when the first officer failed to clear the flight plan discontinuity in the FMC, and neither crew member caught this.
The captain had anticipated and expected that he was high on the approach. He had voiced a concern early on that he was high and air traffic control had left him high. And in reality, he was high on the approach, but only 200 feet as they approached the final approach fix, which was a manageable condition.
But even with these errors in judgment, their instruments would have provided clues that something was wrong.
There were multiple clues that were available to them on the PFD and the navigational display that told them that they didn't have this approach set up correctly and that they missed that step of sequencing the approach. The VDI, or vertical deviation indicator, showed that they were completely, it was pegged to the top, which showed that they were too low on the approach. However, the pilot had the impression that he was high. There was an ATD, or long track distance, that was on the top of the screen that showed them should have been sequenced and should have been showing them to the final approach fix. However, since they hadn't sequenced the approach, it was still showing Birmingham, their original navigation leg. Those were a couple of the clues. They had a lateral offset that was on the navigation display that was not showing them from a left deviation but a right deviation. That was a clue that they didn't have the approach set up correctly. And finally, the flight mode enunciator gave them a little bit of a conflicting information, because when they armed the profile, the armed blue light on the flight mode annunciator that tells them what the status of the automation is, it did illuminate and showed that it was ready to be captured, but of course we know now that because the approach was never sequenced in the FMC, they weren't going to capture the glide slope.
What the captain did next left the first officer in the dark.
When the airplane failed to capture the profile or glide slope down to the runway, the captain reverted to another mode on the automation, the vertical speed mode.
And he didn't communicate this to the first officer. So when the first officer completed the before landing checklist, she was at a disadvantage. She didn't have the same understanding of what the airplane was doing that the captain had. And we would have expected the captain to communicate this to the first officer so that they could work together to monitor the approach and complete the landing as expected.
An expectation about the weather came into play as well. This expectation and the speed the captain chose formed a deadly combination.
They expected to break out of the clouds 1,000 feet above the ground. When they were at that point, they hadn't broken out yet.
He went to 1,500 feet per minute. Now, a normal glide path is going to result in an airplane descending about 700 to 800 feet per minute.
Now, events were happening fast.
In this case, the first officer made the 1,000-foot call out, but she failed to monitor the instruments and alert the captain that he was descending at a descent rate that was twice as fast as their normal descent rate. So as they were getting very close to the ground, things were happening very fast, about twice as fast as normal.
At that point in time, there was a time compression by descending at 1,500 feet per minute. And obviously, 1,500 feet per minute below 1,000 feet, things happened a lot quicker as well.
The crew just ran out of time.
What can pilots learn from what happened to UPS Flight 1354?
This accident was really an accumulation and culmination of several factors that led to the accident. Several small factors, but when they all aligned and added up, allowed the accident to happen.
The lesson in UPS 1354 is, as a crew, if you arrive at the final approach fix and you do not have the approach that you had previously briefed and a shared mental model of what you're going to do on that approach, you need to execute a go-around. If you are on the approach and at any point in time the approach becomes unstable, you need to execute a go-around.
As an investigator, I've seen a lot of tragic accidents, and as a pilot, I've learned a lot of invaluable lessons from those accidents. We wanted to create this video to share the lessons learned from UPS 1354 with the pilot community in the hopes of preventing an accident like this from happening again.
We culled lessons for pilots from the full NTSB report on the crash of UPS Flight 1354. But there were other lessons too. You can find the full report at ntsb.gov.